Night fell on the city in a thick blanket of darkness. The silence seemed to breathe in unison with the wind that gently rustled dry leaves along the empty streets. Officer Michael Carter, a sturdily built man with a stern look and the poise of a man accustomed to danger, walked along the deserted road. His faithful dog, a massive sheepdog named Ranger, walked beside him without making a sound, as if he were an extension of his master. At first glance, this evening was no different from hundreds of others. Empty neighborhoods, the flicker of neon signs on closed stores, the occasional sound of cars passing in the distance. But something, almost elusive, was tugging at Michael. A feeling he couldn't explain, but knew he shouldn't ignore. The air seemed saturated with tension, as if the city was waiting for something terrible. Michael stopped near a dark alley where the streetlights had long since gone out, leaving everything around him to drown in shadows. His hand involuntarily rested on his holster, and his eyes scanned the space carefully. He took a few steps forward, and the ranger growled softly, ears perked up. It was a warning, one that Michael had always trusted more than any of his senses. "Hush, boy," he whispered, peering intently into the thick darkness of the alley. He'd seen a lot of things, from drug-addled robbers to armed thugs willing to kill for a few dollars. But this feeling, it was different. There was no familiar threat here. There was something personal, purposeful, as if someone was watching his every move. Suddenly, there was a barely audible crunch somewhere ahead, a sound the wind couldn't make. Michael tensed, his gaze catching on movement in the shadows. There, in the very corner where the light failed to reach, a figure flashed. One man? No, more. He heard a muffled laugh, husky and angry, the kind of laugh that usually comes from those who feel powerful. Ranger growled again, louder now. Michael crouched down on one knee, putting a hand on the dog's back to calm him. He didn't bother calling for backup. Confidence in himself and his own abilities had never failed him before. But today the air smelled more than danger. It smelled of hatred. "Hey, officer." The voice that came from the shadows was soaked with contempt and mockery. Michael straightened, his hand gripping the hilt of his weapon tighter. A figure stepped into the light. A young white-skinned man grinned as if he had just seen his prey. More men began to appear behind him, one by one, like wolves surrounding their prey. Michael was silent. He didn't know what they were up to, but he knew one thing. There was no turning back. Michael Carter stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the man in front of him, but his mind was scanning his surroundings. The man who'd emerged from the shadows stepped closer, squinting as if checking for a reaction. His smirk wouldn't go away. It was unpleasant, as if it was meant to humiliate. There was silence in the air, interrupted only by the heavy breathing of the ranger, who froze, ready to jump. "So, hero, have you decided to patrol our streets?" the man said mockingly, crossing his arms over his chest. His voice was smooth, but there was venom in it, creeping in around him. "You think you're in charge?" Michael didn't answer anything. He knew that in situations like this, any word could be a spark. He looked around slowly, noticing the others starting to come out of the alley. 3, 4, 6. All white-skinned, with equally predatory grins, a contempt they didn't even try to hide. "This place is not for people like you," said another, taller than the first. He was clearly older, with heavy hands covered in tattoos. "You think uniforms give you power? It's not the uniform that rules, boy." Michael could feel their gazes burning through him. They weren't looking at him as a person, but as a target, something to be broken. One of them took out a cigarette, lit it, and slowly blew the smoke into his face, keeping his eyes on him. "Why don't you say something, huh? Are you out of words?" Another skinny guy stepped forward, bowing his head playfully. "Or do you think your dog will do everything for you?" Ranger growled again, louder than before, and Michael felt the tension building in the dog, but he only yanked the leash lightly, restraining him. The situation was beginning to resemble a powder keg, and each of the attackers was holding a match. "Are you here on business?" Michael finally spoke calmly, his voice as cold as a knife blade. He knew the answer would be mockery, but he needed a few seconds to calculate his options. "Business?" The tall man chuckled, looking back at the others. "Our business is to show you that you are nothing. You think we're going to let someone like you walk around here and call the shots? No, boy, you're just trash." The word had everything in it: hatred, humiliation, contempt accumulated over generations. Michael felt the tension in his chest constrict his breath, but his face remained stony. Their words were meant to break him, to make him lose control. One of them stepped closer, violating personal space. His gaze was insolent, as if provoking. Then, without warning, he shoved Michael in the chest. Softly, but palpably. It was the first step, a sign that they'd decided they could do anything. "What are you going to do, huh? Call your buddies?" the man continued. "Or do you just drop to your knees? It's easier for everyone." The others laughed, cheering him on. The laughter echoed off the walls of the alley, adding to the tension. It was not the laughter of humans, but of predators who sensed that their prey was trapped. They moved closer, almost surrounding Michael. Each of them had the same goal in their eyes: to break him. "I warned you," Michael said quietly, his voice barely audible, but the words sounded like a thunderclap. He felt the ranger tense, ready to jump, and realized the game had moved into its next phase. The darkness that had hidden the strangers now revealed their intentions. It wasn't just a threat, it was a hunt, and Michael realized that he might not come out of this night the same man he'd started it to be. Let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from, and whether you've had something similar happen in your life. We want to know what you think, as well as your suggestions for future stories. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new stories. And we continue. Michael felt the pressure building around him. The gang closed in on him like a pack of wolves preparing to attack. Each of them was eyeing him greedily, as if searching for the slightest sign of weakness. The ranger growled, low, warningly, but Michael barely heard the growl over the rumble in his head. The anxiety was palpable, enveloping him, getting under his skin. "What is it, officer? Scared?" One of the men, tall and broad-shouldered, stepped forward. "Did you think you were the hero around here? You think you're better than us just because you wear a uniform? You're wrong, boy." He spat each word with such hatred that there was a metallic tang in the air. The words "boy" and "officer" sounded as if he had deliberately distorted their meaning, turning them into insults. Another man, older, with deep wrinkles on his face, added, "People like you shouldn't be on the street. You should know your place." Michael tried to stay calm. His face remained impenetrable, but something inside was clenching with rage and resentment. He'd encountered racism before, at work, in the store, on the street, but here, in this dark void, he suddenly realized how vulnerable he was. This time it wasn't a simple glance or a careless word. It was an actual threat, and it was deliberate. You're not going to say anything, are you?" The skinny guy continued, leaning closer. "You think silence will make you strong? No, you're just scared. Just a pathetic nigger in a uniform." The word was like a punch in the face. Michael felt the anger rising in him, like the flames he'd tried so hard to contain, but he didn't even have time to respond. The blow caught up with him from behind, a rough, sharp jolt that threw him off balance. He turned sharply, but before he could see who had done it, the other was behind him, grinning with a grin full of malice. "What, you didn't expect that, tough guy?" The one who had hit him stepped forward, as if testing how far to go. Michael barely kept his balance, but at that moment there was a whoosh in the air, and the second blow came straight to his side. It was a powerful kick that sent him staggering and falling to one knee. At that moment there was a roar of laughter, as if a whole crowd was enjoying the show. "Look at him," one of them said. "This hero is on his knees now. Come on, get up. Show me how tough you are." They laughed, but the laughter was drenched in hatred. To them, it wasn't just a policeman. It was a symbol of everything they hated. A black man in uniform, a representative of the law they despised. Each of them believed they had the right not just to humiliate, but to break. "You know what we can do with you, don't you?" said the oldest of them, squinting. "No one will come here. No one will even know what happened. You'll just disappear." His words were imbued with a coldness that made his insides clench. Michael looked up at him, meeting his eyes for a moment. There was nothing human in them, just malice. The ranger lunged forward, but one of his attackers kicked him. The dog collapsed, squealing, and Michael felt something inside him snap. The sight of the wounded ranger was the last straw. It wasn't just a blow to his faithful partner, it was a mockery of what was sacred to him. "You think you're somebody?" Another of his attackers grabbed him by the collar, bringing his face close to his. "You're nothing. You're just a mistake." Those words tore at him from the inside out, but Michael knew they wanted to see him break, how he would give up, how fear and pain would overcome him. They wanted to strip him not only of his strength, but of his dignity. Michael slowly rose to his feet. He was in pain, his body burning from the blows, but he continued to stand. He met his gaze with each of them, seeing their smirks, their confidence that they had the upper hand. What they didn't know was that they had chosen the wrong victim. Michael stood, his breathing deep but slightly ragged from the exertion. He saw these men in front of him, tall, smirking, soaked in hatred. Their words, like blades, continued to pierce him. But he knew he had to remain calm. His anger tried to come out like a wild animal, but he suppressed it, as he had done all his life. "Listen." His voice was steady, but his insides were seething. "I don't know what you want, but I'm here to keep you safe. We all live in this town. I'm not your enemy." The words hung in the air, but instead of diffusing the situation, they caused another burst of laughter. One of them, a guy with short blonde hair, stepped forward with a look of superiority. "Did you hear that? He's here for security," he said mockingly, turning back to his men. "Safety for who? For the likes of you? You think you're so important?" Michael remained motionless. His hands were clenched into fists, but he tried to keep them relaxed. He knew that the slightest movement could signal the beginning of chaos. "Let me go, and we'll part ways," he said again, calmly but firmly. "No one needs to get hurt." "Get hurt?" The other, with tattoos on his neck, snorted loudly. "You've already been hurt, kid. You're standing here, surrounded, miserable, humiliated, and nobody's gonna help you." Ranger stood at Michael's foot, the fur on his scruff rising, and a low growl erupted through his clenched maw. He was ready to attack at any second, but Michael yanked the leash again, holding him back. "Oh, you think your dog is going to tear us all apart?" shouted another one of them with a sneer. "We'll make a rug out of her." Laughter again, loud, sarcastic. They weren't laughing at the dog, they were laughing at him, at the fact that he was alone, surrounded, vulnerable. They knew they could say whatever they wanted and no one would stop them. "Tell me, how does it feel to know that you are hated just because of who you were born to be?" the tall man asked, stepping closer. His eyes were cold, indifferent, like he was enjoying this moment. "How does it feel to be a mistake?" The word hit Michael again, but he didn't let them see his pain. He'd learned that long ago, as a boy, when he'd been teased at school, when his father had taught him to be patient, because the world wouldn't be a fairer place if you broke. But now, on this night, he felt like he was on the edge. "I just want to go home," he said. His voice trembled faintly, but the gang caught it. "Home." Another intercepted the words, stepping closer. "People like you don't have a home. This is not your home. This town is not for you." Michael knew it was more than just words. It was hatred, deeply rooted in their hearts, and that hatred fed them, fueled them, made them even more dangerous. He could feel their contempt becoming physically tangible, the walls around him shrinking. "You don't understand," Michael said finally, his voice lower, tenser. "You don't know what you're doing." "We don't?" the leader interjected mockingly, his grin growing wider. "We know everything. We know you're a nobody, and today you're going to find out." Suddenly, one of them made a sudden movement, throwing some kind of trash, a bottle or a rock, at Michael. He barely had time to dodge, but it was the beginning of another wave. They began to move closer, swinging at him, shoving him with their shoulders. The eyes of each of them glowed with cruelty, the pleasure of being able to corner a man, to break him. The ranger leapt forward, baring his teeth, and it made them stop for a moment. But one of them waved his hand sharply, as if threatening the dog, and laughed. "You think we're afraid? We're not afraid. You are. Look at you, officer. You're shaking." Michael did feel a shiver, but it wasn't just a shiver of fear. It was a shiver of anger, the same anger he'd been holding in for so many years. He knew that just a little more and he would snap, but he couldn't. Not now. He stood, surrounded, humiliated. But there was a strength growing inside him that they had not yet seen. They thought he was broken, but they didn't know who he really was. The blow was lightning fast. One of them drove his fist into Michael's stomach, making him crouch, making him lose his balance. At that moment, the others came at him like a pack of hungry animals, pelting him with blows. In the face, in the chest, in the back. They hit him chaotically, brutally, without even giving him a chance to regain his breath. "What, hero? Where's your uniform now? Where's your power?" one of them shouted, adding a hard kick to his side that sent Michael crashing to the ground. Ranger roared like a wild animal, lunging at the nearest attacker. His teeth sank into the man's arm, who cried out in pain. But immediately the second of the gang grabbed a metal pipe and swung it at the dog's side. The sound of the impact was deafening, as if something had broken. Ranger fell to the ground with a shriek, trying to get up, but his legs shook. Michael saw it, and something inside him turned upside down. His dog, his only ally in this dark night, lay breathing heavily in a puddle of his own powerlessness. He felt despair overwhelm him, but immediately a new insult forced him to focus. "Look at him," one of the attackers shouted, nodding at Ranger with a nasty grin. "That's your dog, isn't it? A weakling, just like you. What, even she couldn't protect you?" Michael tried to get up but was immediately pushed back to the ground. Face down in the dirt, he felt each blow turn his body into a painful mess. There was shouting and laughter in the air, laughter that filled his soul with unbearable humiliation. "People like you should be crawling," one of the men said, pressing his foot on Michael's back, pressing him into the pavement. "You hear me? Crawl." There was laughter again. One of them, a thin guy with deep scars on his arms, came closer, holding a metal bar. He sat down beside him, eyeing Michael as if he were just a toy. "You thought you were somebody, didn't you? That the uniform makes you a better person? But look where you are now. Under our feet, where you belong." He poked Michael's side with the rod, not hard, but enough to cause pain. Michael didn't respond. His breathing was hoarse, his body burning with pain, but he couldn't allow himself to scream. He couldn't give them that satisfaction. "He doesn't even fight back," snorted the other. "Pathetic, just pathetic. Maybe we should take his uniform off, let him go home in what's left," suggested the third, causing another wave of laughter. They started tearing his shirt, pulling his belt, turning this moment into an act of total humiliation. Michael felt like they were undressing him, leaving him in the dirt, as if they wanted to strip him not only of his strength, but also of his dignity. "Do you think someone will come for you?" said one of them, lifting his head by the hair. His voice was soaked with hatred. "No one. You're alone here, and you'll always be alone." Michael struggled to look up, his face covered in blood, but in his gaze they saw something they hadn't expected, not brokenness. They saw fire, a fire that only flared beneath the layer of humiliation and pain. "You have no idea what you've done," he whispered through clenched teeth. His words made them stop for a moment, but then one of them hit him again, and the cycle of violence continued. But something else was growing inside Michael. Not despair, but determination. A determination that would soon change everything. The ranger raised his head with the last of his strength, letting out a low growl, and it was like a sign that the night wasn't over yet. Michael knew he'd survive because they hadn't realized who they'd chosen as their prey. Michael lay on the cold ground, his body throbbing with pain. He heard thudding blows, the laughter of his attackers, their insults that cut his soul like sharp knives. His head was spinning and his breathing became heavy. At one point, he felt his consciousness begin to drift away. But suddenly, a memory flashed before his eyes. Bright as a flash, it burst from the depths of his memory. He was 16 when his father first brought him to a small martial arts gym in their poor neighborhood. "You must know how to defend yourself, son," his father said, showing him his first move. "The world will not be fair to you, and when it comes down on you, you must be ready." At the time, Michael hadn't yet realized how right his father was, but years of hard training, blood, sweat, and tears had made him not just strong, they had made him dangerous. He remembered the face of his coach who had said, "Never attack first, but if someone jeopardizes your life, act without mercy." Those words echoed in his mind, and the same fire that had long been suppressed began to flare in his chest. Michael opened his eyes. Everything around him seemed to slow down. He saw them, the faces of his attackers, contorted with contempt and cruelty. They continued to taunt him, thinking he was broken. "What, it's over?" One of them kicked him in the side. "You're just a bag we're going to throw away today." But something in Michael had changed. His gaze was different, cold, focused, devoid of fear. The attackers noticed it, but it was too late. "Ranger, stop," he whispered. His voice was hoarse but firm. The dog, despite the pain, obediently remained lying there, growling softly. This diverted their attention for a moment, and Michael took the chance. He rose sharply, his movements quick and precise, like a trained fighter. The first blow hit the knee of the nearest attacker. The man screamed, falling to the ground. The second followed instantly, an elbow to the other man's jaw, causing him to recoil with a bloody face. Michael acted on instinct, his body remembering every training session, every hour spent in martial arts. "What the—" The third man started to speak, but Michael interrupted him with a blow to the solar plexus, causing him to fall, clutching his chest. "You think you're a hero?" shouted one of the attackers, lunging at him with a metal pipe. Michael ducked, caught the man's wrist and threw him over his shoulder with a swing, causing him to hit his head on the ground. The pipe fell, and Michael quickly picked it up, holding it at the ready. Now fear appeared in their eyes. Their laughter disappeared, replaced by confusion. They had not expected that the man they thought was a victim would turn out to be a fighter. "I warned you," Michael said, his voice low and threatening, "but you didn't listen." Two more attackers rushed at him at the same time, hoping to take him in numbers. But Michael was faster. He threw one of them off with a pipe kick to the legs, causing him to collapse, and the other was met with a straight punch to the face that sent him flying backward. "Damn beast," shouted the one Michael had knocked down first. His voice shook, as did his hands as he got up. "You think this is going to make a difference? You're still a nobody." Michael looked up at him, slowly wiping the blood from his face. His breathing was heavy, but he didn't flinch. "This is your chance to leave," he said, looking straight into the eyes of the others. "Go. Now." They hesitated. Their confidence evaporated, but their hatred continued to burn. One of them still tried to pick up the knife lying on the ground. It was a mistake. Michael stepped forward, knocked the knife away, and elbowed him to the ground. The others began to stagger away. "This isn't over," the gang leader hissed, holding the shoulder he'd twisted in the fight. "We'll be back for you." Michael watched in silence as they staggered away into the shadows of the alley. His hands trembled, but not from fear, the rage he had suppressed for so long. He turned to Ranger, who was still lying there, breathing heavily. Michael knelt beside him, gently stroking his head. "We did it, boy," he whispered. His voice shook, and he couldn't hold back the tears that streamed down his scarred face. He stood up, glancing down the dark alley. It was a victory, but it brought no relief. All that remained inside him was emptiness and the realization that this night had changed him forever. Let's pause for one more quick pause. Write in the comments where you're listening to our stories from, and whether you've had something similar happen in your life. We value your opinions as well as your ideas for new stories. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the sequel. As we continue. Michael stood in the middle of the alley, his heavy breathing coming in ragged gulps. Blood dripped from his shattered brow, dripping to the ground, but he no longer noticed the pain. His body, every tense muscle fiber, was ready for battle, for one last effort. His gaze, full of rage and burning contempt, was fixed on those who a second ago had laughed at him, mocked him, humiliated him. But now their laughter was gone. They were beginning to realize that they had chosen the wrong victim. The first of them, a young man with short blonde hair, dared to attack, waving his pipe. His steps were sharp but awkward, his eyes showing uncertainty disguised as courage. Before he could take 2 steps, Michael stepped forward, knocking the pipe aside with one hand and delivering a powerful blow to the solar plexus with the other. The boy bent in half, clutching his chest, then collapsed to the ground with a wheeze. "You! Bloody!" He wheezed, but his voice was drowned out in a cry of pain as Michael elbowed him to the ground. Wasting no time, Michael turned to the next man. This one was larger, older, with massive arms covered in tattoos depicting symbols of hate. He was confident in his strength, but his confidence shook as Michael went at him. The large man swung, but Michael dodged, grabbed his wrist, and twisted his arm sharply. The crunch of broken bones echoed through the dark alley, making the others wince. The man screamed, but that only spurred Michael on. In one motion, he sent him to his knees, then elbowed him in the face, crushing his nose into a bloody mess. "What, you like it when you're not in charge?" Michael said coldly, looking down at him. "Now you'll know what weakness is." The others began to stagger back, but their avenues of escape were limited. Fear began to fill their gazes. One of them, the youngest, nervously reached for his knife, which gleamed in the light of a distant lantern. He didn't have time to do anything. Michael leapt at him, twisting the knife out of his hand and tossing it far to the side. He hit him so hard that the boy fell backward, rolling his eyes. His friends stood shivering but did not rush to help. Their spirits were broken. "You think you're strong?" said the gang leader, a man with deep wrinkles and a cold gaze who was always confident of his power. "We will get our way. You are a nobody. Black nobody." That word was the last straw. It sounded like an explosion that made Michael's insides clench. All the anger, all the pain he'd stored up all his life, burst out. He lunged at the leader, their bodies colliding, and Michael slammed his fist right into his jaw. He staggered, but Michael didn't stop. His punches were fast, precise, and each one was imbued with the injustice he'd endured all his life. Michael lifted the leader by the collar and threw him into the wall. The man hit the back of his head and settled to the ground, his eyes filled with terror. He began to realize that Michael was not a man who could be broken. This was a man who had withstood such attacks all his life, had built up anger and strength that now came upon them like a storm. The others couldn't take it any more. They scattered, leaving their friends lying on the cold pavement. Their flight was pathetic, but Michael did not pursue them. He stood over their leader, who now looked up at him, pathetic and broken. "You asked me what it was like to be humiliated," Michael said, his voice quiet but threatening. "Now you know." He turned to Ranger, who was slowly rising to his feet. The dog was limp, but his eyes glittered with determination. Michael lowered himself down beside him, stroking his head. He knew that this night would leave marks not only on his body, but also on his soul. This night was not just a fight for survival, it was a fight for his dignity, for the right to be himself. Michael stood up, looking back at the carnage he'd left behind. His steps were slow but firm as he stepped out of the alley. There was blood, pain, and screams behind him, but he knew one thing. He would not be so easily broken now. Michael staggered away from the alley, his body aching with pain, but he kept moving forward, holding on to Ranger, who limped heavily beside him. On the face of it, this was a victory. He had stood his ground against those who thought themselves superior, who tried to wipe his humanity into the dirt. But inside Michael there was not a sense of triumph, but an emptiness mixed with an unsettling silence. The night seemed to have frozen, but something in its depths told him that it wasn't over yet. He reached the car and opened the door for Ranger, carefully helping him into the back seat. The dog let out a faint moan, and Michael felt his heart clench painfully. He looked at Ranger, and in his gaze he read, "We made it, buddy." But at that moment, an alarm bell rang in Michael's head. Why had they gotten away so easily? Why had a gang that had been so sure of its impunity suddenly become frightened and scattered? He sat behind the wheel, trying to put the thoughts out of his mind, but anxiety gnawed at him from the inside. He knew people like this don't back down. They plan. They retaliate. The next morning, Michael woke up to a loud knock on the door. 2 uniformed police officers stood on the doorstep, their faces serious, even cold. One of them held a summons, the other a clipboard with a camera on. Michael sensed something wrong at once. He didn't need an explanation to realize that something had gone terribly wrong. "Officer Carter," the older of the 2 said with a cold stare, as if his words were a sentence. "You are under arrest on suspicion of abuse of authority and grievous bodily harm. Raise your hands, please." "What?" Michael took a step back, shock and bewilderment on his face. "What authority? I was attacked. I was defending myself." "We have witnesses who say otherwise," the policeman continued, his voice sounding like a practiced formality. "You, according to them, beat up several unarmed citizens. The video is already online." Michael felt the ground go from under his feet. He tried to understand how this was possible. Witnesses? Video? He knew the gang couldn't be trusted, but he didn't think they'd go this far. His heart beat faster as he remembered that leader's face, his confident look before he disappeared into the shadows. Everything was clear now. "You're wrong." Michael tried to object, but the second policeman had already grabbed his arms and cuffed him. "It's a trap. I was defending myself. They attacked first." "Say it in court," the older man said, turning him toward the car. "You'll have a chance to explain." On the way to the station, Michael couldn't stop thinking about how far these people could have gone. When had they started planning this? Remembering the leader's words, he realized everything had been planned in advance. Attack, provoke, and then make him look guilty. It wasn't just revenge. It was a humiliation aimed at erasing everything he'd built. His career, his name, his dignity, everything was at stake. When he was led into the interrogation room, there was already waiting for him a man in an expensive suit, with neat hair and a ring on his finger that looked like a symbol of power. It was him, a gang leader, but now he looked like a respectable member of society. "Are you surprised?" the man began, smirking. "I told you you were a nobody. You thought you could beat us in our town. You made it too easy." "You're lying," Michael hissed, feeling the anger clenching his fists even in handcuffs. "You know it's not true." "Really?" The man laughed. "Whoever has the most power decides what is true. You think people will believe you? You're just a black cop. I'm a respected businessman. Do you know how many people want to see you broken? And I just gave them a show." Michael felt the words cut into his heart. This wasn't just a personal attack. It was an act of systemic humiliation, carefully crafted and designed to destroy him. Everything he had built was on the verge of destruction. "You can't hide behind your lies," Michael said firmly, looking him straight in the eye. "The truth will come out." "Truth?" The man leaned closer, his voice as cold as ice. "The truth died the second you were in that alley. Now you have nothing." The door closed behind the leader, leaving Michael alone. His hands were shackled, his body still ached, but a new fire was igniting in his soul. He didn't know how, but he had to prove himself. He had to show that not everyone could be broken, and this battle was just beginning. Michael was sitting in a dark, dimly lit pre-trial detention cell. There was silence, broken only by the distant sound of the doors closing and the footsteps of the guards. His body still ached, every movement a dull, muffled pain. But it wasn't the physical pain that hurt the most, but the realization of the injustice that hung over him like a black cloud. He couldn't understand how it had all happened so quickly, how the gang had managed not only to get away with it, but also to turn him, a policeman who was defending his life, into a criminal. The video that was posted online was an artfully chopped-up piece of footage. There were moments where he threw punches, but there was no trace of their taunts, insults, and the beating they subjected him to. It didn't show the injuries Ranger suffered, the way they stood over him, humiliating and bullying him. Michael wasn't just angry. He could feel the system he had served his whole life turning against him. His co-workers, the people who had worked side by side with him, now looked at him with distrust. Some even avoided meeting his gaze, as if afraid that any support might damage their own careers. The first court hearing went like a nightmare. The lawyer Michael had been assigned looked confused and tired, as if he knew the outcome of the case was a foregone conclusion. The opposing side, on the other hand, came prepared. The gang leader, now presenting himself as the assault victim, sat with an icy calm, surrounded by lawyers. His expensive suit and confidence in every word contrasted with the image of the criminal Michael had seen that night. "My client was brutally beaten," the prosecuting attorney thundered. "This officer, with all his power and authority, used it to harm unarmed citizens." The words burned Michael like boiling water. He clenched his fists, trying to control himself. But the worst of it was that they made him seem not just violent, but racist. "Officer Carter has repeatedly shown hostile behavior, especially toward white citizens," the lawyer continued, waving some documents. "We have witnesses who confirm his bias." "That's a lie," Michael snapped, standing up. His voice came out loud, booming, piercing the courtroom. "I was defending myself. They attacked me. I have to have the truth on my side." The judge looked at him coldly over his glasses and banged his gavel. "One more offense, Officer Carter, and you will be removed from the courtroom," he said sternly. Michael slowly sat back down, feeling the rage boiling up inside him. He looked at those who were now sitting across from him, grinning and smug, and realized that they were enjoying the process. For them, this was not just revenge, but a demonstration of their power. Proof that the system that was supposed to protect people like him could easily backfire on them. But the most painful part was the emergence of new witnesses. A middle-aged woman who claimed she saw Michael attacking for no reason. An elderly man who claimed he always knew this officer was unreliable. These were fake people who said whatever was asked of them. But every false story they told was another blow to Michael. After the meeting, Michael returned to his cell. His soul was as heavy as a stone. He tried to find a way out of this situation, but everything seemed hopeless. The whole system was rigged against him, and he was just a man, alone and broken. The only one left with him was Ranger, who was temporarily sheltered at the veterinary clinic. Michael remembered his gaze, full of pain and devotion, and it made him clench his teeth. He couldn't give up, not for himself, for Ranger, for his honor, for all those who believed in justice. But the next day, the situation worsened. The local news channels began to spread headlines. Officer attacked civilians. Police officer exceeded his authority. Racist aggression among police officers. Michael sat in his cell, hearing the guards discussing him behind his back, people passing by, casting contemptuous glances. Every minute seemed like an eternity. He knew that his enemies were celebrating, that they were sure of their victory. But deep inside Michael, there was still a spark. He thought of his father's words, of how he had always told him, "Justice doesn't fall from the sky. It must be wrested from the hands of those who want to hide it." Michael realized that he was going to have to fight, that this battle was not just for him, but for everyone who had ever been brought to their knees by the system. But in order to stand, he had to pull himself together. He knew there was more pain ahead of him, but he was ready. He had to be ready, because the truth was always on his side, even if the world was against it. A few weeks had passed. Michael Carter sat on a wooden bench in the abandoned park that had once been his sanctuary, a place where he spent time after a hard shift. Today, the place seemed as empty and lifeless as he was. His face was riddled with small scars, his bruises only pale shadows, but there was still a war going on inside him. The career he had spent years working towards had been destroyed. Those he considered comrades had turned their backs on him. His name was now so tarnished that a return to normalcy was out of the question. The trial ended a week ago. Despite his best efforts, despite standing in the courtroom and speaking loudly about the truth, the system had put a stop to his case. Guilty. They gave him no jail time, perhaps because of his merit, but it wasn't enough. He was dishonorably discharged from the police force. The wording sounded like a punch in the chest. Gross violation of professional ethics. He knew that this entry in his personnel file would follow him for the rest of his life. He remembered the last day at the police station. As he left the building, a group of colleagues stood in the corridor. Some were staring at the floor, avoiding his gaze. Others, including some he considered friends, smirked openly, as if to confirm that he didn't belong in their circle. It was even more painful than the false accusations. He hadn't just been kicked off the force, they'd cut him out of their lives. Michael raised his eyes, looking up at the frowning gray sky. He felt like an outsider in this town he'd grown up in, the one he'd fought for. Every glance from a passerby, every whispered phrase made him feel like an outcast. Newspapers and news sites hyped his case, making him look like a monster, a villain who had become a threat to those he was supposed to protect. But despite all of that, Michael knew it wasn't his fault. He remembered that alley, that night filled with hatred and anger, and realized that he had been fighting for something bigger than himself that night. He was fighting a system that was designed to break people who looked like him. But the system won. It always won. At that moment, there was a sound nearby. Michael turned his head and saw a group of teenagers. They were standing nearby, their faces a mixture of admiration and sympathy. One of them, a tall boy of about 15, came closer. "Are you Officer Carter?" he asked with a slight uncertainty in his voice. Michael nodded silently, studying the young man with his gaze. His clothes were simple, but his eyes were intelligent and full of life. "I've heard about you," the boy continued. "You fought against those guys. You weren't afraid. That's inspiring." Michael froze. He thought his name had become a symbol of shame, but to this boy he was something more. There was no mockery in his voice, only respect. "You know," Michael said finally, his voice hoarse. "Sometimes fighting doesn't change anything, but that doesn't mean it's not worth fighting." The boy nodded, looking at him with an admiration that Michael hadn't seen in anyone's eyes in a long time. The group of teenagers remained standing back, but Michael felt that his actions, his struggle, had somehow touched their souls. Maybe it was a sign that he had done something important. A few days later, Michael learned what had happened to the gang that had ruined his life. 3 of them were arrested for assaulting another black man just days after their trial. A video taken by a bystander became proof of their crime. However, the leader, a man who used his connections, remained at large as expected. He continued to run the business, remaining untouchable, as if there was an invisible protection over him. But that didn't matter to Michael anymore. He knew life would never be the same. He was fired, his name was ruined, and it seemed the future was dark and hopeless. But somewhere deep inside him, a fire still burned. He didn't know where the road would lead him, but he knew one thing: he would fight. And his story, as it turned out, began to take on a life of its own. People who heard about how he stood up to hate began to talk about it. His name became a symbol for those who faced injustice. People started writing him letters, leaving messages, sharing their stories. His feat, however tragic, became something more. A few months later, Michael Carter left town, taking the Ranger with him. He left behind his service, his career, but his actions left a mark. And even if he didn't change the world, he showed that there's still room for courage, even when everything is against you. And that, in the end, was his real victory. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you experienced racism or injustice in your life? We really need to know what you think. We appreciate each and every one of you, and your support helps us continue to share stories like this. Subscribe to the channel, give us a like, and write the phrase, "I'm listening until the end," in the comments, so we know who stays with us until the last words. Have a great day, and take care of yourself.